Thank you, Jeff, for joining me on the show today. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. I've been looking forward to the conversation for quite some time. You're a big profile on Twitter. You're a founder and managing partner of Chapter One, previously VP of product and revenue at Tinder. A lot of experience working with startups, now investing with startups, and excited to ask you some questions. I think first and foremost, the way I like to get started is asking guests to share their story from as early as they're willing to start to how they got to where they are today and some of the decisions you made along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in around Menlo Park, always kind of around technology and the startup industry, although I didn't know it at the time, because I was a kid and, had a pretty normal childhood. I played a lot of sports. I was always interested in, I was an early user of AOL and used to hang out in chat rooms. And one of my hobbies growing up was I collected a lot of sports memorabilia and cards. And so I guess my entry point to entrepreneurship was I ran a pretty prolific memorabilia operation out of my bedroom where I was would go in AOL chat rooms and negotiate deals, and we'd use old fashioned mail and UPS to ship things around the country and around the world, and really like love that process of deal making and kind of the intersection of social and finance and investing, whether I knew it or not, happened to me at a pretty young age. Then ended up going to UCLA eventually and thought I was going to become a screenwriter because I was studying English at the time. And I had some success there. I got my first screenplay option, but sort of hated all the gatekeepers within Hollywood and entertainment. So ended up quickly leaving. My first real job was at UTA, which is a talent agency in LA, where I was working in the digital department, which was trying to take YouTube creators and transition them to TV and film. And so I was kind of 1 foot in tech and 1 foot in kind of old media, and decided to just do it. So I one day moved back to San Francisco and then started applying to jobs at basically any startup that would accept my application. Had a pretty brutal and painful process. I applied to be an early employee at Uber. This was 2010 and 11. Uber, Airbnb, and Twitter. And didn't get any of those jobs, but a startup in Kansas City called Zarly wanted to hire me. And so within 24 hours, I moved to Kansas City and became an early member of their team. I was doing marketing, community, basically everything they wanted me to do, and ended up really falling in love with product. And so that became the focus of my career. Was primarily doing growth related product work, and then ended up going to Tinder, where at the time in 2015, we didn't have a large product org. And so quickly realized there was a really cool opportunity to help build the subscription business, and joined when we were doing, I think, $20 million in recurring revenue, and helped with a great team build that to a public company. We were doing, when I left, about $1.5 billion in revenue per year. And so kind of all the while I was investing in startups through my own syndicates, other people's syndicates. I ended up becoming a scout for Index Ventures, and then officially raised my first fund in 2019. So that's kind of my life in a nutshell. But yeah, happy to answer any other questions.
Yeah, it's awesome, and appreciate you sharing the story from the early days. I'd heard from listening to you on other podcasts that you had this business, or whatever you might call it, hobby as a kid, where you were writing a pretty absurd number of letters, it sounds like, to famous athletes and the like. I think Bill Gates was on the list as well, and getting some pretty cool responses. And it resonates with me because I've been doing, probably not as prolifically, but I've always reached out to people, and mainly via email since, I don't know, like, middle school or high school or something. And that ultimately sort of came to fruition in the form of the podcast, where that's how I get all my guests. And I appreciate the fact that like you reach out to a bunch of people who are unlikely to respond. You get a few unlikely responses. What's something that sort of stuck with you from that very early, like formative experience, just doing what you love, meeting athletes, selling cards and things like that, to later days building a company, um, as heading revenue at Tinder, and then maybe even more likely, like, doing investing now and meeting a lot of great founders and raising capital from LPs. How is that like sending letters as a kid turned into an actual like career hack if it's via emails or the like?
Yeah, I think it's definitely more related to investing, but I just learned at an early age that you really can reach out to anybody, as long as you can find their physical address or email address, and I have still have zero fear of rejection, and I don't take a non-response personally. So as an investor, it's kind of having the courage to email founders or other folks when you don't necessarily know if they will respond. And then, even beyond founders, like just mentors, people you think are interesting. It could really be anybody who you think you can learn from. And a lot of times, if you can offer something to those people before, as part of like the upfront ask to have a conversation, it goes a long way. So one like real example was I used to go to Golden State Warriors basketball games, and I was obsessed with game used basketball shoes. And my way to get players to give me their shoes after the game was I would go on eBay. You could buy a big, like a lot of cards is what they called them. So you could buy like 100 cards of that player, and every player needs their own cards because they use them to send their fans autographs. So I kind of knew that if I brought like a big like sleeve of their own cards and give it to them, then ask them for in return a pair of shoes after the game, they would be more likely to do so. And that kind of and that worked. Like going and giving them something before you make an ask really did work. So when I approach people, I always think about what I can offer them, whether it's information, a point of view, before asking for their time. And I think that's just a big part of my approach, is always trying to kind of add value whenever you ask for anything.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One thing, I mean, it's interesting that you even thought to like think of what the athlete might need, and like you thought of something that's just super tangible and obvious and like is going to apply for all of them, most likely. Trying to translate that to, investing or what I'm doing, like reaching out to people to have them on the podcast, et cetera. Um, it's interesting to think about like what's something that everyone needs, and you just sort of mentioned like information is helpful to a lot of people if you find information that they need. But for me, there's sort of a balance as well, as like people, if you sort of load up too much on what you're giving, then people view it as like a time suck. They're like, oh, this is like way too in detail. Like, I don't even want to get into this. Like, and they just move the trash. Do you ever
Yeah.
think about like how, it's obvious enough if you give them a sleeve of sports cards, like here it is, no time, this is useful to you, give me your shoes. But like, do you think about how to compress the value that you offer in, analog situations as an investor or the like, when sort of giving that value up front before you ask for something?
Yeah, I think it comes down from having, well, I would say it's become easier as my career has progressed, like, and you become more of a known quantity in whatever field you're in. And so it's definitely become easier. I think the bare minimum is just, respecting someone's time, and so not asking for too much up front, and then doing some research, so your ask is personalized, and that recipient feels like you've actually taken the time to understand a bit about their lives or whatever they're doing. So it's not just like this spray and pray approach. So definitely personalized, and then also understanding timing. So I think you know when when I reach out to founders, like you have to time it well, so it's not like if you reach out to a founder right after they finish fundraising as an example, they're probably tired of talking to investors. And so you have to think about kind of their day-to-day lives and um, pick and choose your spots. But yeah, I think you always have to just consider like the day-to-day realities of whoever you're reaching out to, and try to respect their time. I think is probably the biggest part.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I won't dwell too much. This topic is very fascinating to me. Obviously, I sort of incorporate it in my day to day, but I want to go back to something you mentioned also in the earlier part of your story when you were looking to break into tech out of the entertainment industry, and you applied to Uber and Airbnb. I think you were like, you said it was early days, but I think you would have been like top 10 or 20 employees at each of them. And those are, behemoth like you couldn't have applied to better, more promising companies at that time,
No.
probably. Um, was it just were you applying to 100 companies and those were on the list, or do you think there might have been something about what you looked for in startups that, first of all, that would be useful if there was sort of a secret recipe that you can now apply to your investing framework, but I'm curious if, despite what you've learned in between, even back then, you think there was anything, if you can remember, that you looked for in companies to apply for that stood out that led you to identify those couple?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, frankly, was luck and circumstance. So in the case of Airbnb, I was lucky to have known Doug Leone, who's a partner at Sequoia Capital, and basically went to his office one day and asked him what the best company in his portfolio was, or where he thought I should look at it. And his immediate response was Airbnb. I think they had probably 40 employees at the time. And then, I just thought about what my skill set could do for that company. And, I think for both Airbnb and Uber, they were both pretty operationally intensive businesses. And so it wasn't going to be just a bunch of engineers writing, writing code and building software. They needed a lot of humans to help build those companies. So I didn't come from a technical background at the time, and so that was part of it, was looking for companies who had some operational complexity where I felt like my background could fit in. The Uber example was just luck as well. I was working out of a co-working space called a Rocket Space, which people who were in San Francisco in like the 2010 era probably remember. But I sat next to the first 10 employees of Uber. They were at the desk next to me, and just kept seeing the team grow and would like talk to them, um, during the day. And it just seemed like they were just kicking butt. And I used the service, and it was just so clear if you lived in San Francisco at the time that Uber was necessary. It took like 45 minutes for taxis to arrive, and you had these kind of shady black cars driving around the city, who would kind of yell at you out the window and ask you if you needed a ride. Like, it was just a very inefficient marketplace and system. So, but they were pretty lucky. One was asking someone I knew who was smarter than me for advice, and the other one was just putting myself in the right place. I think I knew if I moved to San Francisco and worked out of what was the best co-working space at the time, that I would meet a lot of people. So you have to put yourself in situations where you can get lucky. And some of that back then was physical locations. I think now increasingly it's become like creating serendipity for yourself in digital worlds. So joining the right Discord groups, being active on Twitter, like really being online, I think is probably like the new version of me hanging out at Rocket Space.
Yeah, it's interesting. That sort of leads to what I was thinking. You're talking about, the serendipity, like you said, of, asking someone in person in their office, Doug, when he referred you to Airbnb, and then the co-working space with Uber also being based on where you are in person. And now, with things, I understand like you're making all your investments over Zoom, everyone's working remote. That in-person spontaneity is being lost in a lot of ways, but perhaps, as you sort of suggested, replaced by sort of digital serendipity. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about sort of the differences between the two. Like you obviously, you save on I guess there's a couple of things, right? Like one is, if you live in India or Africa, you sort of have at least closer to the same opportunity to find that online serendipity, join the right Discord, follow the right people on Twitter, listen to the right podcasts and things like this, as someone in, Nebraska or Boston. Whereas it would have been much easier for the person in Nebraska or Boston to move to San Francisco in the 2000s. So I'm curious just your thoughts on this sort of transition from a world in which physical serendipity is sort of king to one where potentially digital serendipity sort of takes over.
Yeah, I think as you said, everything's much more global, which is awesome for the entire ecosystem and creates a lot more inclusivity and diversity, which is great. The other piece of the online world, which is better, I think, than the physical world, is you just have a much longer tail of interests and groups. Like if I wanted to, I don't know, join like an NFT group in San Francisco right now, that wouldn't happen at a co-working space, and it'd be really hard to like show up to a physical location and find my people. But I find that online, at least, it's kind of like your imagination is the limiting factor. You can, if you dive deep into any niche or sub vertical, like odds are there are other people who are equally passionate about that online too. So it just, I think it comes down to being hyper curious and allowing yourself the time and space to kind of wander the internet and find those communities. And then once you find them, being active and contributing and actually adding value, especially, we're seeing this more with DAOs in Web3, like figuring out ways to contribute to those groups, and suddenly your reputation sort of precedes yourself. I've seen 18-year-olds in crypto who are more famous in Web3 than like Web2 builders who built some of the biggest social products, and that's because they're kind of living and breathing the space, and they're actively building products within Web3. So not to make this a crypto podcast, but yeah, I think it's a really amazing time where you can kind of find your tribes online, and a lot of those groups you can lead to opportunities that you can't even predict, whether it's jobs or co-investments. It's really just an amazing time to be online.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure we will make this a little bit of a crypto podcast. This is at least like a third or a half of a crypto podcast, but also about
We can go there.
yeah, we will, but also about people's stories. So I want to touch on a couple more things that you had mentioned. One, and maybe there's no real answer here, but you didn't end up at Uber or Airbnb, and I think I choose to look at things like they happen for the best, and things certainly seem to have worked out for you. But you started in Kansas City, and
Yeah.
I'm curious if maybe independently from the job itself, if you can sort of separate it, if you had any takeaways or learnings or things that have sort of stuck with you from that experience just living in Kansas City, which in the industry that you're in, whether it's, angel investing, venture investing, or previously like working for a startup, that's actually a pretty unique experience. And I'm curious if you took anything away from living out there.
Yeah, definitely. It's actually informed so many parts of my career in really deep ways. So um, I think the most obvious thing is when we were building consumer products in Kansas City, we had I would say like a really real feedback loop from people who really like did not care about the tech industry and just cared about whether what you were building made sense to them and was simple and added value. Like the kind of insider baseball of the tech industry just didn't apply there. And so as a product person, was just like the best audience to build for, because I think when you build products, and specifically if you build products within kind of like tech bubbles, you sort of build meta products for people who are like you, and forget that there's a big world out there. So especially at Tinder, like I was always thinking about the people I met along the way who weren't in the Bay Area, who were in Kansas City and other parts of the country where I traveled. And it really, I think to me, reinforced the idea that there's, you shouldn't be building um, for your peers in tech, especially this applies mainly to consumer. You really need to expand outside your bubble. And then in investing, I love investing in companies who have a go to market that's focused on, I call it like the rest of the US. So not the Bay Area or New York or LA, kind of like the flyover go to market. And I've invested in quite a few companies in the past couple of years. One's Misfits Market, which is I don't know if you know Imperfect Produce, but it's probably a direct competitor to Imperfect Produce, and their whole go to market was actually targeting the Midwest, which I thought was really smart because there was more white space. And then there's a company called Sunday Lawn Care I invested in, which just raised the Series C, but they're building really smart, personalized lawn care that is delivered to you every quarter in a box they use basically Google Maps data to create a custom lawn kit for your lawn. It sounds so simple, but when like that pitch was going around the Bay Area, I think a lot of people laughed at it, but it turns out that there are 87 million lawn owners in the US and most of them aren't in San Francisco, which again, like I think I kind of look back on the Kansas City days and thought about just the needs outside of kind of the tech audience. And so that's a big part of what I do, is thinking about what people outside of tech need. And that's what I try and build and invest in.
Nice. Yeah, it certainly sounds like that was a useful experience, and I'm sure you gained a lot just from the experience with work as well. But living in Kansas City independently sounds like it was worth the year or two or however long that you were there. Last sort of off script thing. Not, well, there's no script, but off general
I was gonna say I
topics.
didn't see a script.
Yeah, off general topics, and basically before we get into crypto and investing and the like, you mentioned that you were an English major. Heard on another podcast that you were really inspired by Catcher in the Rye, and particularly, and wanted to, you thought you were gonna do a lot of writing in your life, and you mentioned like the screenplays and all of that. I'm curious if this bug hasn't completely left you, if you are gonna write a book someday, what you think that book might be about. Is it going to be like a fiction or nonfiction, or anything you could sort of speculate if you could see yourself writing one day?
That's a great question. I've thought a lot about writing a book, and in the past couple of years, I've explored different ideas around books for based on how to build products and how I kind of the frameworks I've used to design products. I actually think that's like, it's almost like by the time you write the book, the playbook's already changed. And so I think probably for me, more likely would be doing like a Substack that's probably has like the format of a book, but it's just delivered to you more in real time. Everybody I talk to who writes a book just goes through hell for years to get that thing published. And so I think, going back to kind of my entertainment industry experience, like I'm not a big fan of gatekeepers. I personally have like a fairly large online audience at this point, so just going direct to that audience, I think, is really probably the path I take. In terms of the topics, it would probably be nonfiction at this point. And I think right now my mind's really wrapped around Web3 and crypto, but that changes all the time. So I'm not entirely sure what it would be about, but yeah, I remain open to the idea of writing a book. Writing's hard. It's a hard skill to kind of keep fresh. I feel like I was probably a better writer maybe 10 years ago, and now I feel like I just fumble around when I open up a Word doc to write anything. So, but hopefully one day we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't sell yourself short. I read some of your stuff. You have been publishing on Medium for almost a decade, I guess. And I think it started in like 2013 or so. And they're short pieces, but hopefully you can share something longer at some point. I'm sure a lot of people would like to read it. And you mentioned, you've built this big Twitter following. I sort of started off by introducing you, I think first and foremost, as a big Twitter profile, and you laughed. Obviously, that you've done a lot of other things as well, but it's actually like a notable thing these days. Like you build a following of 100,000 people, a million people on Twitter. It can be potentially like life-changing if you sort of handle it the right way. And you can get financial freedom through that. You get distribution for your ideas and can make some influence that you want to make in the world. You had written, I think, at some point or tweeted or something about how I think it was the best decision of your career. You said to start living your life very online and be very open about life and things like this. So, best decision implies obviously you've gained a lot from it and it's pretty apparent. But I'm curious, like both the pros and cons of that decision and maybe some insight into like how and when you made it and all that.
Yeah, definitely. It kind of happened by accident. I think in 2008, I joined Twitter, and always loved kind of putting myself out there online in terms of writing. So I think when my audience sort of grew was at Tinder when we were doing so well and being on the kind of like the lead of the revenue team. Most of our a lot of our public success was around the fact that we were becoming a just a behemoth of a business. We were the top grossing app in the world. We were just like completely, I think, capturing people's imagination because Tinder was seen as being this kind of like fun hookup app. And, underneath the hood, we were building a really interesting business. And so I just started sharing a lot of the kind of behind the scenes decision making and thoughts around what we were doing, and people thought it was interesting. And so I didn't there wasn't a strategy around anything. It was just sort of like, hey, I found the more I kind of gave online, the more I received in terms of meeting interesting people. And also one of the best parts, I think, is it just shortcut introductions to people in terms of them knowing me. Like even this conversation now, you have a lot of context for who I am, what I've done. And I've always tried as much as possible to make the online version of me as close to the real life version of me. Although you do sometimes take on like the role of a character, but I think when I meet people, they have a sense of what I'm interested in and kind of how I think about the world and approach life. So yeah, I think there's very little downside to being very online. There used to be groups of people who were worried for some reason that it would hurt them at work or whatever else. And I think the opposite's been true for everybody I've known who have kind of lived this way.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I'm much later to the game. Just started a Twitter, I think like January of last year of 2020, and the podcast, that summer, and blog a little before that. And so it's starting like my sort of online brand or whatever you want to call it. And to me, it's like very obvious that when you're on Twitter and tweeting and all that, like it's a very, I don't think it's that people are trying to be inauthentic. I mean, maybe some people are, but I don't think like everyone's trying to be inauthentic. But I do think that everyone, with almost no exception, like comes off, you get a different sense of who they are from like looking at their Twitter. And part of it's like good and accurate, but it's just
Yeah.
impossible to like portray yourself completely accurately via, you know, 280 character tweets once in a while or whatever it is. Like it overemphasizes certain things and underemphasizes others, or things are completely absent. So I think about this a lot, and like I try to make my Twitter somewhat in line with who I am. And I do think in some ways it's like even more at my core than certain things that I do share with like my good friends. But on the other hand, there's certain like sort of trivial day-to-day things that never come up on Twitter that are just like totally absent from someone looking at me from the outside in. What do you think for your sort of online presence is a little bit missing maybe that people, assume wrongly about you or don't know about you? Um, and what do you think that, contrary to that, what do you think that Twitter does a good job, that your Twitter does a good job of sort of capturing about who you are?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think probably what's missing is just the day-to-day, like I don't want to say struggles because that sounds, but just like the fact that like even when you like kind of make it, you're still constantly doubting yourself, and you're always kind of questioning how you'll stay relevant, how kind of like you'll evolve, and whether what you're doing is important or valuable. And so in the context of Twitter, I think it appears that everybody's kind of figured their lives out and has like wakes up in the morning and like everything's working, and they're just constantly winning. But the truth is, all of us have failures, and I have many every single day. But it's not always like it's not always winning. I think people on Twitter don't share kind of the struggles quite as much as they do the success. So, and then, I think another part of it is I think people probably bucket you into being like a Twitter. For me specifically, like a Twitter investor or someone who kind of made their career because of Twitter. And I think that's probably not entirely true. Like it's been as I said kind of earlier in my career, with all the jobs I haven't gone, it hasn't been easy. And so Twitter's certainly been a great part of helping me advance in my career, um, but I wouldn't call myself like a Twitter investor. I think I want to be known for just being a great investor and a hopefully a good person, and that's more than my Twitter presence, I think, kind of allows sometimes.
Yeah, I think what you said definitely applies for me as well. And I'm sure a lot of people, and again, it's not necessarily like not wanting to share that, it's like everyone has problems, but no one has problems on Twitter. And I don't think that it's that no one wants to share problems necessarily, but it's like, okay, you share your problems and like, let's take it to the extreme, like you're Jeff Bezos or something. No one cares about your problems. And in fact, everyone like comes down hard on you because you share that you have a single problem and like everyone has problems. It's all relative, etc. So there's like no, it's partly, I think, just the design of the thing
Yeah.
that makes it the way it is, for better or worse. But I think it's sort of important to acknowledge the difference between people and their Twitters because I think it is very real. Um, Obviously, it's pretty apparent from like our conversation and also just getting to know you through your public content prior to this, um, that persisting through failure and just having a general, um, obviously you feel rejection and failure just like the next person, but just being totally, fearless about this sort of thing and continuing to go for it no matter what has been a theme in your career. If there's another and your life and your success and everything like that, if there's another sort of theme or like core principle or just something that you think about often that you think has equally or close to equally sort of contributed to your success, I'd be curious to hear what one of those things might be.
Yeah, I think it's more of a mindset. It's like I think I always have the mindset of being a little bit of an underdog. And so it's placing yourself in situations where you actually are the underdog and trying to, and then once you achieve what you want, then like you remove yourself from that situation and go advance to the next level, and then you're suddenly an underdog again. So it's trying to constantly just like challenge yourself to be at the bottom of whatever totem pole you're trying to get to, and then trying to level up. And so that's been a big part of it. And then I think another part of it's just like trying to be trying to be happy with where you are in your career and your life, and not just sort of know that things will work out however they're supposed to work out. And so I used to stress a lot about everything I was doing, whether I was, picking the right job or whatever it might be. But just kind of learning to trust your gut has been a big part of my learning. And so it might seem like overly generic, but a lot of it's just kind of having trying not to stress. I find when, like, especially for investing, if my head isn't clear and if I'm stressed or feeling external pressure, I make really poor decisions. So I try and just be super level headed throughout the day. And even when things go wrong, and I find I make really good decisions when I'm not stressed out. So again, that might be pretty basic, but I try not to get too emotional, whether it's happy or sad about anything that happens in my life.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I think there's like a lot of what do you call it? Bumper sticker wisdom that is actually like really underrated. Not that that was bumper sticker, but you said like basic
It
and
might
like,
be.
yeah, no, maybe it is. I don't know. We didn't condense it enough perhaps for a bumper sticker, but you said basic. I think there's a lot of sort of basic things that people sort of know are right, but or would be helpful, but they just don't sort of put them into practice. And if everyone just did the very basic, like most fundamental things that they sort of have an idea are right, then we wouldn't need to stress about all these other things that there seem to need to figure out. It's like really, it's all sort of fundamental if you just focus on those things. I personally think. All right, so I think it's time to jump into crypto now. We've been waiting long enough. So I guess let's start. How did you come to get into crypto in the first place? Was it Bitcoin? Was it a little bit later than that? Curious to hear sort of your origin story there.
Yeah, it was originally Bitcoin in 2013, I want to say, and just dabbled and bought some Bitcoin and forgot it existed. Was looking at different projects as an investor in probably 2015 that I unfortunately did not invest in, such as Filecoin. And then probably towards 2017, really started to get into altcoins and was kind of falling down the rabbit hole. And through that process, I was still at Tinder, was spending most of my nights and weekends investing in private sales. So I was doing things outside of my fund. I mentioned I didn't raise. I was a scout for Index Ventures, and they gave me a pool of capital to invest in, which I decided to dedicate primarily to crypto. And so in 2017, 18, invested in some really interesting companies. So the seed rounds of Dapper Labs and Compound Finance, The Graph, Blockfolio, Lolly, and some others. And sort of, in 2019 and 20, or the first part of 2020, those investments weren't really performing that well. Like, it wasn't clear that any of them were working. And I was simultaneously raising my first fund. So I had to, at least while I was fundraising, take a more generalist approach to what I was doing. And then summer of DeFi in 2020, and then kind of the NFT explosion in Q1 2021. A lot of those investments started to do quite well. And then the graph also started to do really well. So I've been caught up in all of the excitement on the building side. I think the most exciting part of Web3 is just the amount of creativity and talent that is flocking to the space right now. And as an investor, it's where I'm spending 100% of my time right now. And so it's been for me just like a really cool moment where I feel like I'm aligned with my investors and have the data points to show that that not only do I love the space, that I've invested well in it, and have just like a pretty long leash to go to go explore what's happening in the space right now. And so yeah, we're so excited about so many parts of the ecosystem, but what a crazy year. And just I've never felt more excitement in the founder community. I was around during mobile in 2010. I think the difference here is like everybody's way more online. So the excitement in 2008 to 10 in mobile was similar, but it was more happening, like as I mentioned, like in co-working spaces. And now it seems like that everything being Twitter kind of being the microphone for crypto has just made it just a phenomenon like I've never seen before, and it's just been awesome.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you invested in Dapper Labs early on, and it wasn't necessarily clear that it would be a big success until more recently. But what did you see initially when, because I think that's billion, several billion dollar maybe company now, um, hugely successful. What did you see back then that was exciting versus, since then NFTs have really come onto the main scene, and what's sort of come to fruition of what you expected or what's different? Just curious to hear sort of like the before and after there, pre and post, huge success.
Yeah, I was in a really lucky position where I was at Tinder, and so we were building and selling digital goods at Tinder. They weren't NFTs, but everything we were creating was unique IP that was software and had zero marginal costs. And so when I saw CryptoKitties come out, I had this background in collecting, which I mentioned when we first started. I was, an obsessive collector growing up, and so the mental leap to from physical to digital goods, based on my childhood and also the fact that I was building digital goods at Tinder, was really easy for me to conceptualize digital value and how the younger audiences and people who were internet native could value digital goods the same way you value physical goods. And so CryptoKitties came out, and it just sort of checked all the boxes for what I thought was interesting from digital goods. Goods, it had scarcity, it had community. It was definitely experimental, and just knew upon talking to Roham that if they could apply what they were doing to other IP, and if they could partner with really interesting folks like the NBA, then they could have it could be a really powerful thing. And so I don't claim to have like had the vision for it becoming this big, because I don't think any of us did. And if we did, we would have all probably tried to put a lot more money into the company. But did it had so many interesting themes, and a lot of people thought CryptoKitties was silly, and it kind of was. But I think the common like trope you hear is like the best consumer investments start out looking like toys, and it certainly was a toy, but became and has become a massive business. It's really one of the larger marketplaces in the world right now, and is a $7.5 billion company in terms of where they raised the last round.
Wow, yeah. So even more than NFTs, I saw a tweet from you that you're excited about ENS, identities tied to wallets. You said you were thinking about that a lot. What are you thinking about, and why is that concept generally so exciting to you?
Yeah, I think ENS domains have exploded. There's 400,000 plus unique ENS domains, and what really caught my attention was when I started in crypto, your wallet was this kind of private, dark, shadowy place that you didn't want to share online. And when I saw people attaching their Twitter identities to their ENS domains, which you can go to on Twitter and you see .ENSs as people's profile names, and what you can do is you can copy and paste that into Etherscan or anywhere else and look at all their digital assets. Which to me, if you think about the world of finance, how private kind of like our bank accounts were up until really a few years ago. And I think Robinhood probably changed a lot of this, but finance has become so social and public, and the fact that people are willing to attach their IDs, their real life identities to their wallets and publicly share that is really powerful and creates this really interesting foundation to create really amazing social experiences. And so yeah, it was, I think this is a really, probably for me, it's more interesting than NFTs. And reason being, I just think it's like a really interesting phenomenon, which is new to me in my life, which is people are just being a lot more transparent and social with everything they do with their finances, everything they invest in, all the projects they in, everything they, eventually the DAOs they join. Like you're seeing like people open source their own personal financial activity, which is really a powerful Web3 concept, because it's uniquely Web3 being it's on chain. So you actually have that data, which anyone can query and view at any time. Whereas Web2 is still very much closed source and behind whatever brokerage or platform you use. Like that's not open for the public to see. So yeah, there's a lot of threads, but I just think I think the fact that we have now these, ENS domains and could end up being larger than the Facebook login in terms of just creating really simple ways to onboard into any network. And you have your ENS also allows you to create profiles, so you can create avatars, you can attach biographical information, and that becomes portable to any Web3 application you use, which is again even more powerful, I think, than the Facebook login, because this is all attached to actual financial activity that you do on chain. And it's, let's be honest, it's not stuck within Facebook, which is not the ideal authentication layer for the internet, as we've seen in recent times with just Facebook's tribulations. So yeah, it's a powerful concept. I think people are starting to really tune into what's going on, and certainly where I'm spending most of my free time exploring.
Right. So I understand you guys are at your fund chapter one. You guys are incubating a Web3 product, but it's in stealth mode, and the nature of stealth mode is I'm sure you can't really say anything about it. If there's anything you can say, feel free to do so. If not, though, I'd be remiss to wrap our conversation without having to talk a little bit about chapter one and what makes you guys different. In particular, like you raised at a time, like you mentioned, where at least the first fund you raised sort of before some of these crypto bets you had made started paying off. And so you had imagined it, I would think, or at least presented it at the time, because you didn't really have the investments track record to show that you could be like a crypto focused fund. But at this point, have you sort of come to the place where you are looking at this as more of a primarily crypto fund, where you'll be investing in crypto projects, or still startup landscape as a whole? And I know I'm giving you a lot to chew on here, but
Yeah.
this will be my last question. As a part of that, you also started chapter one like on your own, as sort of what people are calling like a solo capitalist, but you've since gone ahead and started to build out a team. And I'm curious what sort of was behind that decision. And since I just gave you about five questions, you can feel free to answer like any one or two of them, but want to end off by talking about chapter one.
Yeah, so the incubation has mostly been an idea exploration process around the intersection of social experiences that we know well from Web 2 and crypto. So kind of the intersection of social and crypto, and trying to reimagine what kind of a Web 3 social platform might look like, and what people would do and what they care about. And so it might actually lead to us. The funny thing is we've explored some of these ideas so deeply, and we're starting to meet teams that are actually building what we're what we've been exploring. And so I'm happy to invest in those ideas as opposed to building them. But it's been an amazing experience for just like I really feel like we've gone down we've gone down the idea maze and we've really like fleshed out some of these ideas and have now I think a perspective on them. So when we meet founders, we can kind of speak the language and have have gone as deep as mocking up these ideas and have so that's been helpful. The Web3 kind of chapter one question, whether we're a crypto fund, we're I don't think it's kind of necessary to like come out and say we're a crypto fund. To me, it's largely kind of proof of work, right? Where you have a portfolio that kind of speaks for itself. And we've done over 20 investments in the space. And I think have a track record that's competitive with a lot of the crypto native funds who we work with and love working with. So I don't feel that the need to kind of like say we're a Web3 fund or crypto fund, but in terms of where we're spending our time at, we're spending 100% of our time in the space. So I think the portfolio will probably look pretty much like a crypto native fund. And then the solo GP question, I started chapter one as a solo GP kind of out of necessity. I didn't have partners around the table. I raised fund one while I was still at Tinder. So it wasn't, there wasn't like this grand vision for building a team. As I've done this full time, I think I've recognized more that I need to build a team because the market's hyper competitive. So to compete, it helps to have a team around you. And then, I think the second part is I just really love being on teams and have always enjoyed having teammates. And so I'm actively like, I think one of the uphill battles probably of what are like the chapter one brand is getting out of this like solo GP bucket and saying, and we're kind of removing myself from like being the front center of the fund at all times and saying, hey, there's a really great team around me that we're building, and they're amazingly smart in ways that that probably I'm not, and so we complement each other really well. And so yeah, I'm trying to get us out of the solo GP bucket. I think a lot of probably solo founders deal with this too, and it again it was a way to get started. I think one of the benefits of being a solo GP, at least for now, is that when we add teammates to the equation, we can be really generous with equity and carry, and have just like a larger pool to distribute. So that's been a bonus for sure. But yeah, and what makes this different, I think was the last question, was we're hyper focused on product design, and kind of growth and distribution as our core themes. But I'd say product and design are really core to what we do. And so when we work with teams, we kind of tell them, we're not good at everything. Like I'm probably not going to be the best person to give you sales advice if you're building out a sales team or whatever it might be. Like we're really focused on helping you get from 0 to 1 with your experiments and your ideation. The stage we're investing is pre-seed and seed. So there tends to be kind of like, there's not generally like a VP of product, and we try to help fill some gaps and just be a voice of reason for teams who are making tough decisions as to which products they should build, and kind of where to spend their engineering energy. And so that's a big piece of it. But again, I think it's a work in progress, and probably what chapter one looks like now will be much different in a couple of years.
Well, that was a very impressive answer to a lot of questions, so I appreciate it, and I'm excited to see what you do with chapter one moving forward. I know we're running up on time, so I want to thank you again, Jeff, for coming on the show. It's been Awesome talking with you, and appreciate your candor and transparency throughout the conversation, and thought we touched on some really interesting things, and not 100% crypto, but some crypto.
Hey, I
So
like
where
the
can
crypto combo. So yeah, it's really fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, exactly. So where can and thanks for coming on. So where can people in closing go and follow you and chapter one? Where do you want to send people to keep along with your journey?
Yeah, I would say the easiest place is JMJ on Twitter. So at JMJ, and then obviously we have a chapter one Twitter account, which is at chapter one, but really, yeah, follow me on Twitter. Hope this was interesting, and see you online.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jeff, and founders listening in. You know where to go for your next investment. Obviously, Jeff's a good guy, and sure, I'll be happy to invest if it's worth it. So, thanks again, Jeff. It was awesome talking with you.
Yeah, appreciate it.